everyone, and welcome to this edition of Right Reason with Dr. Charles Rice, Professor Emeritus, University of Notre Dame Law School. Right Reason, that's our show where right makes might, turning that around to the way it should be.
Yeah, right.
We're going to jump right into the topic here today and get into the question of contraception. And how do we arrive at the truth, the moral truth about contraception? What is it, the terms? But let's talk about something first. In the when somebody says they have a right to something, and we'll segue into contraception about that, because all these people saying I have a right to this health care, and I'm not sure how condoms are health care, but anyway. Yeah. When someone says they have a right to anything, what does that mean? Do I have a right to something just because I want it?
Well, you have to define what context you're talking about in terms of rights. Under the Constitution, our Constitution defines certain rights, but those rights are immunities against government action. They're not entitlements to things. Iredell Jenkins was one of the great natural law teachers at the University of Alabama, actually, in the American Journal of Jurisprudence, wrote this up in a really great article years ago, where he said the concept of rights and the competence of courts. And he was talking about the fact that the idea of constitutional rights has morphed, has changed. So it's become not an immunity against government action, but rather a claim on government to do something for you, which is the Barack Obama theory of rights, actually. Right?
Yeah, unfortunately, he's not alone.
Right. Now the other question is in the moral sphere. The church has talked about rights in broad ways, and you have a moral right to to be able to live. You have the church even says the unborn, the child has a right to be conceived in the conjugal act and raised in the family. That's a right before he even exists, all right? So they're talking about rights in the moral sphere. And in some respects, the church is talking about rights that should be recognized by government, immunities, all right?
Such as what? Give
Well, the right
examples.
against self-incrimination.
Okay.
You also have rights that the government should, or the state should, and the community should try to implement, rights to adequate medical care, rights to adequate housing, etc. But what is important to keep in mind there is the principle of subsidiarity. The fact that you say that you have a right to adequate medical care, and that is a human right.
Based on what?
Based on creation.
Okay.
The church in the 20th century has adopted the language of rights, which is totally different from the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution. Those rights came from the state, and they were subject to the state. The church in the...
like the right to drive a car.
Well, yeah, not only the right to drive the car, the right to live.
Okay.
In the French Revolution, that was subject to the right to the power of the state. But the church in the 20th century, the popes, have emphasized universal rights. John Paul II and John the 23rd. And these are rights which you have because of your creation in the image and likeness of God. But the thing that is overlooked is the question of who should implement those rights. The fact that you have a right, moral right, to health care, for example, doesn't mean that the state should be the provider in the first instance.
Who should be?
The community, the family, subsidiarity.
Okay.
The family, the community, the church. All right? And that's the...
So if I go to, if I have cancer, and I need an operation
Right.
and all the subsequent treatment after that. The state doesn't have shouldn't be the one covering that, but my family should?
In the first instance.
Okay.
The one difference between the principle of subsidiarity and the United States Constitution is this. The United States Constitution, properly interpreted, which is
properly
interpreted. That's we're talking ancient history,
Yeah.
but the United States Constitution, properly interpreted, ruled some things totally out of the federal realm. Education, for example, apart from land grant colleges, the federal government should have nothing to do with it. Providing health care really is not in their constitutional orbit. And
yet we have both right now.
I understand, but the idea of the Constitution, as it was intended, was that these things are not within the delegated powers of the federal government.
Right.
And if they're not, the federal government can't do it.
Yeah, which article of the Constitution is it that says if it's not explicitly laid out, it reverts to
The
the
Ninth
states?
and 10th Amendments,
Ninth and 10th, right.
But the principle of subsidiarity is not that watertight. The principle of subsidiarity recognizes that social tasks should be performed, if possible, by individuals, by families, by private groups, by churches, only if necessary by government.
Right.
Then by the lowest possible level of government. But it doesn't absolutely exclude governmental action.
Okay.
But the provider
Government's a last resort.
precisely. The provider should be government. So this is the whole question of what should the treatment of illegal immigrants be, where the popes have emphasized that illegal immigrants, even if they're illegal, have rights, and they should not be treated as non-persons.
Right.
That doesn't translate automatically into the government as the first provider for those people, you see. So
Right.
these are serious questions. There was an article by Professor Ray, R-A-H-E, Hillsdale College, back in February 2012, who wrote about the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And he
That caused quite a
you
stir
know
on
that?
the internet.
Yeah, you
in the
know that? You
blogosphere.
seen
Yeah,
that?
yeah. He wrote a part one and then kind of let me go back and revise this a little bit, part two. And
Right.
that caught fire all around
Well,
the
I'll
Catholic
tell you,
blog.
his point was well taken. He said in the 1930s,
Yeah.
the Catholic Church in the United States, the bureaucracy, adopted the New Deal in a sense. And the Catholic Church adopted the idea that charity
Yeah.
is, the obligation of charity is met by getting the government to do it.
Right.
All right? And that doesn't mean the government should never act in this area.
Right.
That's not the Catholic position.
But it made the government a first responder.
Yes,
Right.
and it absolved the church, the community, not just the Catholic Church, but religious communities
Yeah.
of their obligation.
Yeah.
That's why Catholic Charities USA today gets most of its money from the federal government.
Yeah, I think it's over $2 billion.
I forget the number, but
Yeah.
it's incredible. So the
I'm sorry, that was a misspeak. It's Catholic Charities and Catholic Relief Services together
Yeah.
get something in the neighborhood of $2 billion from the government.
well, it's and the whole question of freedom and all the rest of that comes into this, but subsidiarity is what's ignored in that whole area. So, where does that take us?
Well, okay, so we have this understanding of I have a right, but rights have terms. If I have a legitimate right to something, that imposes an obligation on you or a duty on you
somebody.
to provide it, not
That's
you.
right. That's right.
So give us okay. Let's go with the basic one first mentioned in the U.S. documents, founding documents, a right to life. Who has a duty imposed on them to ensure my right to life?
In the United States Constitution, The right to life is really an immunity against government action.
Okay.
All right? It depends on the amendment.
Mm-hmm.
A private person can violate the 13th Amendment,
Which is?
which is anti-slavery. It
Okay.
abolished slavery.
Mm-hmm.
All right? So everybody has a right under the Constitution not to be enslaved. And the 13th Amendment applies to individuals as well as to the states
Okay.
and to the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody can violate the 13th Amendment.
Okay.
The 14th Amendment, which guarantees privileges or immunities of United States citizenship, equal protection, and due process of law, binds only the states. So neither you nor I, as private citizens, no matter how hard we try, can violate the 14th Amendment, all right? Unless we're in conspiracy with
Government
a state
agency
official.
or something.
Right. So that, you have to look at the particular right
Okay.
in constitutional terms. And what the church is saying in terms of the fundamental human rights, which the 20th century popes have adopted,
Mm-hmm.
what they're saying is that these come from the dignity of the person as created in the image and likeness of God. And they are things that have to be respected by all who are concerned in the particular situation. But it depends on what right you're talking about. And it's subject to the principle of subsidiarity. And if you look at Benedict's three encyclicals,
Mm-hmm.
especially Caritas and Veritate, he gets into this, the social thing. And he talks about the necessity for virtue. And he talks about development, that development has to be subject to the moral law and all the rest of that.
Mm-hmm.
He's not arguing for the state as the dispenser of rights. And John Paul, in his various social writings, just condemned what he called the social assistance state, because he said what it does is just grow government and violate individual rights.
Do you think that there is a do you think that the American jurisprudence system has sort of reached a point of no return with regard to how it's viewing rights?
I think it's close to it. I think what you're dealing with is a fundamental.
It's a shift, isn't it?
Yes.
Away from what we're just going to protect this to we're going to give that.
That's correct, and part of it comes from the fact that the American legal system has moved away from the recognition that your rights come from God, not from the state, and that happened in this way. The United States Constitution, the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, so Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That was intended to require Congress, meaning the federal government, to be neutral as among religious sects.
Right.
They couldn't prefer Baptists or whatever.
Right.
But the government could still recognize God. And the Supreme, and they did, the same day they adopted the First Amendment.
Right.
The first Congress called on the president to declare a day of national thanksgiving to God.
Right.
All right? But the Supreme Court has interpreted that. So it's no longer neutrality among religious sects, but neutrality between theism and non-theism,
Right. Right.
which is impossible.
That's a huge shift. Sure.
Well, it's impossible to have that
Sure.
because it comes down to this, as Justice Brennan said, the words under God are not necessarily in the Pledge of Allegiance, are not necessarily unconstitutional because, this is a quote, he said, they may merely mean this nation was believed to have been founded under God. So it's technically unconstitutional, according to the Supreme Court, to affirm that the Declaration of Independence is actually true.
We're going to come back to it. We're going to take a hard break right now and come right back to that. We'll be right back right after this. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Right Reason with Dr. Charles Rice. We're talking about rights and freedom, how they play into each other, and how they are greatly misunderstood in the current culture that we have, Western contemporary culture. Doctor, let's talk specifically in this, as we're taping this, it's the middle of the election, 2012 election, the primary season, and there's a lot of chatter about a right to contraception because of the HHS mandate. Does that phrase, a right to contraception, even exist in a sort of logical world? Is there a right to contraception?
No more than there's a right to larceny or a right to shoplifting or whatever, or a right to masturbation, if you want to just put it in the individual terms. You have to ask the question, what is contraception? Mm-hmm. And it's, as was recognized by the entire Christian tradition until 1930, it is a social as well as moral evil. Mm-hmm. And it separates the unitive and procreative aspects of sex. It makes man, of both sexes, the arbiter of whether and when life begins. It changes the conjugal act. The conjugal act is an icon of the Trinity, a matter of self-gift. And it also affirms that there is a life not worth living, the life that would have come into effect had we not done this, all right? And so it can't be a right, moral right to contraception.
He said there's no more than a right to larceny. I mean,
it's a moral evil. Larceny involves invading somebody else's rights. All right, that's why I mentioned masturbation.
Sure,
right?
sure.
Yeah.
So, but so you're equating what two consenting adults happen to do in the privacy of their own bedroom, to use all the jargon, to some theft or masturbation, or I mean.
No, okay. Wait. Let's be careful about this, because when we're talking about a right in terms of a moral right to do something, you never have a right to do something that's morally wrong. You never have a moral right to do something that's morally wrong. You may have a legal right you may have a legal right to an immunity from legal restraint on doing that.
Say that again?
Okay. You may have an immunity to legal prohibition of your doing that. For example, you don't have a right, a moral right, to be sinfully angry. All right? Mm-hmm. You don't have a moral right to do that. But the government is supposed to, the law is a rule of reason to promote the common good. And the government, as Thomas Aquinas said, shouldn't try to enforce every right or forbid every vice or enforce every virtue. So
you don't have a moral right to get all unjustifiably angry and lose your cool. But just because you don't have a moral right to do that doesn't mean that the government therefore has a right to come in and say you can't do that.
You got to be careful. The problem today is that in the era of Obama, and it's not just Obama. It goes back
he's the figurehead
a long
for all
time.
this.
It goes back a long time. In this era, the idea of a right, which in the constitutional terms was an immunity to government action. You have a right to freedom from self-incrimination. That means you have a right to immunity from any government violation of that. Okay. The concept of a right today is translated into a concept of a right to government to subsidize it. Mm-hmm. And that's where we've gone completely off the rails. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have a right to health care. It doesn't translate into a right to have the government pay for it as the single payer of first resort, right? Under subsidiarity, the principle of subsidiarity, which means that social tasks should be done by private entities, by families, by churches, only if necessary by government, and then by the lowest level of government. Under the principle of subsidiarity, government may have a role in providing health care. Sure they do. If somebody comes in to a city hospital and is in need of emergency medical care, for example, yes, they have a right. The government has an obligation to provide that. But that doesn't translate into making the government the provider of first resort for the health care for everybody. And that's what's happened today. So that if you have that law student at Georgetown,
Right.
who
Sandra Fluke.
who was claiming that essentially that she was injured in her rights because the government is not, Georgetown is not providing her contraceptives. Nobody's providing her contraceptives. She has to buy them. Well, she can get them free from Planned Parenthood,
Right.
but practically free. But you see, that's the mistake. We translate the fact that you may have a right. You do have a right. I think, let's put it this way. You have a right not to have the government make it a crime for you and your spouse to use contraceptives. That's none of the government's business, all right? That doesn't
Sound like a raging liberal, Dr. Rice.
No. This is Thomas, St. Thomas. St. Thomas said the government should
St.
not...
Thomas was a liberal?
No. Yeah, right.
Time out.
What'd you forget? He was a graduate of Notre Dame Law School. Right?
He was one of your finest
Right,
students.
I had him in torts. You got to be, yeah, all right. But what he emphasized was that the law should not try to enforce every virtue or forbid every right.
Right.
So the classic case of Griswold was a stupid law, which was used by the Supreme Court to import into the Bill of Rights this fictitious right of reproductive privacy. And the Griswold law was a stupid law because it made it a crime for married couples to use contraceptives. So how do you get your evidence, you see?
Right.
And so you could say, well, there really is a right to an immunity against that kind of government action.
Okay.
It's a moral right. That doesn't translate into a right to have the government buy your contraceptives.
Right.
See? And that's where we are today. And the concept of rights has been greatly distorted. But you have to distinguish the constitutional rights from moral rights. Sometimes they coincide.
So I don't have a moral right to use contraception. I do have a legal right to an immunity from the government coming in, stopping me.
I think you also have a moral right to that.
You have a moral right to the government not
Yeah, I
stepping
think
in.
so.
Sure. But I don't have a moral right to use contraception.
No more than you have a moral right to defame somebody. I mean, you just don't have a moral right to do an immoral thing.
Right.
So what? That doesn't translate into the fact that government should prevent you from doing it.
Right.
I mean,
Or even going to the other extreme, the government should subsidize you, in fact, doing it.
well, that's exactly right.
Right.
So you have to be, sometimes moral and constitutional rights coincide. You have a moral right not to be enslaved.
Right.
You have a constitutional right because of the 13th Amendment not to be enslaved. And that right, unlike the 14th Amendment, is enforceable against everybody,
Against a person.
against private persons, federal government, state government.
Nobody,
Yeah.
no level of society may enslave you.
That's exactly, no person.
Right.
And that's where a constitutional right overlaps with the moral situation. But what you're seeing here goes back to what Professor Ray talked about, which was the fact that the Catholic Church, going back to the 1930s, began to turn over to government the function that really is a function of charity.
Yeah.
See? And they began to say, well, the government will provide for the old people. And that you say, okay, does government ever have a duty to do that? Yeah. But it depends on subsidiarity and circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
It could be. But this was a universal system of government as the first provider. And what it ended up doing, as Ray correctly pointed out, was that it really worked against the duty of children to support their parents.
Right, of course.
See? So that there are all kinds of unintended consequences. I'm not throwing rocks at anybody, and there are all kinds of unintended consequences that happen. Francis Perkins, the Secretary of Labor under President Roosevelt, was a devout Episcopalian. Spent a lot of time in the Catholic churches. Yeah, she was a very sincere person and very well-meaning person. But that doesn't mean that the government should be the first provider of these things.
What is a right based on? A moral right based on?
Well,
does that reference back directly to God?
Your rights exist because of your dignity as a person.
Okay.
You have a right. You're made in the image and likeness of God. You're entitled to respect. Right? You have a yeah.
But if that's the case, let's say you're an atheist and you don't believe that there's a God, and so if that's the case, if you're an atheist, do you just simply sort of eject the whole understanding of a moral right? So if the rights aren't moral and aren't intrinsic to who you are, then I guess the only authority you actually get the rights from is the state.
That's where you end. I think honestly that's where you end up. Once you rule God out of the equation, you end up there. Because unless you are able to put the concept of rights in a transcendent mode, where it transcends the state,
right,
then it becomes something which ultimately becomes a gift of the state.
So it becomes just sort of immanent to the state.
Yeah, it becomes a gift of the state.
Right.
And that's that's
the state gives and the state takes away.
Well,
Blessed
yeah.
be the name of the state.
yeah, I know. Well, hey, listen, it goes back to the social contract theory. The social contract guys, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and et cetera, said, well, the state owes its origin to the social contract, to the consent of the people. And if the people give you your rights, they can take them away.
Sure.
And that's where we are in this situation. So the ultimate answer to these problems, as especially Pope Benedict has been pointing out, is to recognize that you need a moral consensus for any society to operate.
Yeah.
All right? And the only ultimate moral consensus that will make it operate properly is recognition where rights come from. They come from God. Because the reason you have transcendent rights is because you are made in the image and likeness of God, and you're immortal. You see, every state that has ever existed or ever will exist, and every corporation that has ever existed or ever will exist, has gone out of business or will go out of business.
Yep.
Every human being who has ever been conceived will live forever.
Right.
See? So that's why you have rights that transcend the state. And if you deny that, if you deny that you get your rights from God, you're out to lunch, ultimately, in terms of protecting rights.
God, not surprisingly, as just a sum up, God is the linchpin upon which everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's right. And you have rights even if you don't believe in God. All right.
Right.
All right. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
You don't have to return the duty. Well, you do, but you don't.
Right, yeah,
have to
yeah,
return the duty.
yeah.
That's right. Well, this is a fascinating conversation. It's a fascinating, and it's the type of conversation you really don't hear. You really don't hear this. You may hear it in sort of esoteric type journals and things, but you don't hear just sort of the plain spoken everyday down.
Yeah, I
here
know.
on
But
the street.
all we're doing, Mike, is retailing.
Yeah, that's
That's
it.
all.
That's all we're doing.
None of this is original.
We're not manufacturing.
None of this is original. We're just retailing, and that's it. So.
That's it. Well, that's it. Well, we'll wrap up this one, and we'll get on to the next show when we get to that. So, for Right Reason, I'd like to thank you. I'm your host, Michael Vorse, with Dr. Charles Rice, Professor Emeritus, University of Notre Dame Law School.
Yeah.
Woohoo! Go Notre Dame. Well, at least go Notre Dame the way we love Notre Dame.
Yeah, go for it.
Right Reason. Remember, where right makes might. God bless you. Thank you very much.